My son dropped his two kids off at my place 11 years ago and said he'd be back before supper. He came back this spring, all right? He came back with his wife, a lawyer in a suit that costs more than my truck, and a sheriff's deputy holding a piece of paper that said I had been keeping those children against the law. They had it all worked out. The crying wife, the witnesses, the medical records. Nobody could explain. They figured I was just a worn-out old man who'd sign whatever they put in front of me and shuffle off quiet. What they didn't know was that there was a brown envelope sealed up inside the wall of my machine shop, behind the bench where I keep my taps and dies, and that I had been waiting 11 years for somebody to finally ask me about it. When I laid that envelope on the judge's bench, he went pale. He looked at it, then he looked at me, and he said real quiet, "Do these children know about this?" And I told him the truth. "Not yet," I said, "but they're about to." Before I tell you what was in that envelope, do me a small kindness and hit that like button, and leave a comment telling me what town you're watching from. I read every one of them. It helps an old man feel like somebody's listening. Now let me start from the beginning, because you need to understand how a man ends up paying to keep his own grandkids, and why he keeps the receipt. My name's Earl Maddox. I'm 68 years old, and I spent the better part of my life running a little auto body and machine shop on the edge of Cutter's Bend, Ohio, a town small enough that the one stoplight blinks yellow after 9. My knees are shot and my back tells me when the weather's about to turn, but my hands still work fine. My wife Lorna passed 6 years back, and after that the shop and those two kids were about all I had left worth getting up for. The morning everything came apart. I was standing at the stove frying scrapple because that's what my granddaughter likes on a Sunday, and I was doing the math in my head on whether I could stretch the month far enough to get my grandson the cleats he needed for the spring season. My pension and what little Social Security I draw comes to a hair under $3,000 a month, and after the house and the power bill and feeding two teenagers who seem to grow an inch every time I blink, I've got maybe $60 left to my name. I'd been dropping it in a coffee can on top of the fridge. Those cleats were 3 weeks away. I never heard a knock. One second I had the spatula in my hand, and the next the front door came off its hinges, and there were boots in my living room and a voice yelling at me to get on the ground. I'm 68. I got on the ground. My cheek was pressed against the floor. Lorna and I laid ourselves the year we bought the place, and out of the corner of my eye I watched my granddaughter come out of the hallway in her sleep shirt, with her hands up and her face white as paper, and I heard my grandson crying behind his bedroom door. And I thought, this is it? This is how a man's heart actually stops. Then I heard her voice. My daughter-in-law, Shelby. I hadn't laid eyes on her in 11 years, and the last time I had, she'd been 23 and skin and bones, with that thin, shaky look people get when they're more chemical than blood. The woman standing in my doorway now had a camel-colored coat and a manicure, and a face like she'd been sleeping 8 hours a night for a decade. She pointed at me with one polished finger and said, loud, for the cameras the lawyer had brought, "There he is. That's the man who took my babies." And behind her, my son stood there in a new shirt with his hands in his pockets, looking at the floor, looking anywhere but at me, looking anywhere but at me. Looking anywhere but at the two children who used to call him nothing at all, because they didn't remember they had a father. They handcuffed me in my own kitchen with the scrapple burning on the stove. The lawyer, a smooth gray man named Lawrence Quill, leaned down close to me while the deputy read off my rights and said, in a voice like a real estate ad, "Mr. Maddox, this can be easy, or it can be hard. The Bend's a small town. You don't want to die in a small town jail." I didn't say a word to him, but I looked past him at my granddaughter, who was 16 now and smart as a whip, and already filling out college applications she hadn't told me about. And I caught her eye, and I gave her the smallest nod I could manage. The nod that meant, don't say anything, don't fight them, I will fix this. And God bless her, she understood. She always did. That girl read me better than anyone alive except her grandmother. They put me in the county lockup downtown. Now, the law works fast when there's money behind it and slow when there ain't. And there was a mountain of money behind this. By the time my arraignment came around, I had a public defender named Pell, A kid who couldn't have been 30, sweating through a polyester suit, dropping his pen, telling me the district attorney was talking about felony kidnapping and unlawful restraint of a minor, 2 counts, and that the other side was suing for full custody and damages, and that the wife had already done a sit-down with the local news where she wept about the years she'd spent searching for her stolen children. He showed it to me on his phone, Shelby on camera, dabbing her eyes, saying she'd never stopped looking. My son sitting beside her with his hand on her knee, nodding. That's a lie, I told the kid. Every word of that is a lie. She didn't search for anybody. She left them on my porch and drove to Florida. Pell looked at me the way young people look at old people they've decided are confused. Mr. Maddox, he said gently, the court has photographs. They have a medical file from a clinic showing one of the children was treated for malnutrition. They have a neighbor of yours willing to testify he heard children crying and saw bruises. I'm not saying I believe it. I'm saying that's what we're up against. And right now, you've got nothing but your word. I leaned across that scratched metal table and I said, Son, I've got more than my word. I've got a piece of paper, and when the time's right, it's going to land on that judge's bench like a sledgehammer. But I can't get to it from in here. I need to make a phone call. The call was to Sully. Sully Pratt runs the salvage yard out on Route 9 and has been my friend since we were both 18 and dumb enough to street race down the river road. He's 66 now, walks with a hitch from a forklift that fell on him in '04, and he is the most loyal human being I have ever known. When I told him through the jailhouse phone what I needed him to go get and where it was hidden, there was a long quiet on the line. And then he said, The shop. Behind the bench. The brown one. That's the one, I said. Earl, he said. Earl, he said. If that paper says what I think it says, they're gonna come looking for it too. You know that, right? People who spend quill money on a SWAT team for an old man frying scrapple, they're not gonna leave a loose end like that lying around. I know it, I said, which is why you've got to get there first. To understand the envelope, you have to go back 11 years, to a night in August when my son's truck came up my gravel drive with its headlights swinging crazy in Shelby, in the passenger seat with 2 little kids buckled in the back, a girl who was 5 and a baby boy who wasn't but a few months old. My son got out and he wouldn't look at me then either. He told me they were in trouble. He told me they owed money to people you don't owe money to, that they were going to lose the apartment, that they needed to take a few weeks and get straightened out, and could I just keep the kids for the summer? Just the summer. I said yes before he finished asking. Of course I said yes. Lorna was still with me then, and she had that baby out of the truck and against her shoulder before I'd even gotten the words out. We figured the summer. We figured they'd dry out, they'd get clean, they'd come back changed, and we'd hand the kids over and cry and be grateful. That's what you tell yourself. The summer ended. They didn't come back. Lorna would set 2 extra plates out of habit and then put them away. I drove down to their old apartment in October and it was rented to somebody else. I called the numbers I had and they were disconnected. Around Thanksgiving, my son called once, drunk, from somewhere with music behind him, and said they were working on it, and asked if I could wire him a few $100s. I didn't. It was the following spring that he showed up in person. And this is the part I never told anybody, not even the kids, not for 11 years. He came alone, in a different truck, and he sat at my kitchen table, and he laid it out plain. He and Shelby were going to make a fresh start. There was a man down in the Gulf who had a charter operation and a boat for sale and a partnership on offer, and they needed cash. He said the kids were holding them back. He said it like that. Holding them back. About a 5-year-old and a baby. And then he said the thing I have never been able to scrub out of my ears. He said, Look, Pop, if you want 'em so bad, buy 'em. 25 grand and you'll never hear from us again. We'll sign whatever you want. I should have thrown him out. Part of me wanted to put him through the screen door, but I'd been around long enough by then to think 2 moves ahead, and I knew that if I just let him drive off, he could come back anytime, any year, on any whim, and tear those children right out of the only home they knew. So I did the coldest, clearest thing I have ever done. I said, all right, but it's going to be legal. Every bit of it. I sold my Harley. A '69 shovelhead I'd rebuilt with my own hands twice over. The only thing I owned in this world that was purely mine and not the family's. I sold it to a collector up in Columbus for $19,000, and I emptied the savings account Lorna and I had been feeding for 30 years to make up the rest. And I drove to the bank and got $25,000 in cash in a manila envelope. Then I called the one lawyer I knew, an old fishing buddy who's gone now, and he drew up a document, and we did it right, in front of a notary, with my son and my daughter-in-law both signing. A voluntary and permanent relinquishment of all parental rights. In exchange, they accepted the sum of $25,000 in cash and agreed in writing never to contact me or the children again. They signed it without reading it twice. Shelby was already counting the bills, and as they drove off, my son leaned out the window and laughed and called back, "Tell the Rugrats their daddy bought a boat." 3 weeks later, I got, in the mail, with no note, a single photograph. The two of them standing on the deck of a brand new boat in a marina under a Florida sun, both of them grinning, Shelby in sunglasses, my son with his arm around her, and painted on the hull behind them in fresh blue letters the name they'd given that boat. They named it Second Wind. They sold their children for $25,000 and a boat called Second Wind, and they were proud enough of it to mail me the proof. I sealed that photograph and that notarized document inside a brown envelope, and I hid it in the wall of my shop, and I raised those children, and I never spent a single day expecting to need it. I'd have given anything, never to need it. Now here's the part the people in the comments always ask about, and the right to ask. Where was everybody? How does a town not know? Well, the town knew. That's the answer. Everybody in Cutter's Bend knew those were my grandkids, and that their parents had vanished. My granddaughter's teachers knew. The pediatrician, Dr. Holloway over on Cherry Street, had a file on both of them 11 years thick. Every well check and every flu shot and every note about a healthy, loved, well-fed child. And the county had a file too. Because back when the kids first stayed on, a caseworker named Ms. Delgado came out and did a home study and interviewed both children and signed off that they were thriving in my care. All of that existed. All of it was on record. But here's what money does. Lawrence Quill knew all those records existed, so he poisoned the ground before anyone could read them. He got a clinic 2 counties over to produce a treatment record for malnutrition dated to a stretch when my grandson had actually just been a skinny kid going through a growth spurt. He found the one man on my road who'd had a grudge against me since I refused to fix his transmission on credit, and he paid that man to swear he'd heard children screaming and seen bruises. And he timed the whole thing so the first anybody official heard about it was the wife crying on the 6 o'clock news. By the time the truth could get a word in, the lie had a 2-week head start and a lawyer in a $1,000 suit standing behind it. That's how it happens. It doesn't happen because the town's blind. It happens because somebody pays to keep the town's eyes shut just long enough. And the reason they came back at all, after 11 years of silence, was the simplest and oldest reason there is. Shelby's father, a hard old man named Crandall who'd made a fortune in trucking down in Georgia and never spoke to his daughter after she ran off, had died that winter. And Crandall, who never met those grandchildren but apparently couldn't stand the thought of his money going to the state, had left it in trust. A trust for the children. Better than $4 million, locked up tight until they each turned 21. With one detail that explained everything. The legal guardian of those children was to receive an annual allowance of $200,000 for their care, plus the right to live in Crandall's house outside Savannah until the youngest came of age. $200,000 a year in a mansion, just for being the name on the custody papers. My son and my daughter-in-law had blown through the boat money in a dozen schemes since, and they were broke and getting old. And then out of nowhere, their abandoned children turned into the most valuable thing they'd ever owned. So they hired Quill, and they came home to collect. While I sat in that cell staring at the ceiling, Sully was doing what I asked. He told me the rest of it later, over and over, until I could see it like I'd been there. He drove out to my shop a little before midnight with his headlights off the last quarter mile. He said the place felt wrong before he even got out of the truck. Too quiet. The spring peepers down by the creek all gone silent at once, which any countryman will tell you means something's moving out there that shouldn't be. He let himself in the side door, and he was halfway to the workbench when a flashlight hit him square in the face, and then a second one, and then a third. 3 men. Not cops. Quill's men. The kind of muscle that money like that can rent by the hour. One of them said, "The old man sent you for his little keepsake." And another one laughed and said something about how Mr. Quill had figured the rat would come sniffing back for the cheese. Sully Pratt is 66 years old with a bad leg, and there were 3 of them, half his age, and he didn't have so much as a tire iron in his hand. But Sully spent 40 years pulling wrecked cars out of ravines, and he is built like a fire hydrant, and he does not scare. When the first man came at him, Sully grabbed the closest thing on the bench, which happened to be a 15-pound bench vise I'd been meaning to remount, and he swung it like he was throwing a horseshoe, and the man went down and stayed down. The second one got an arm around his neck, and Sully drove them both back into my part shelves and brought the whole rack down on top of the 2 of them. And in the noise and the dust he got loose. But the third man, the calm one, the one running it, had already gone straight to the workbench, because somebody had told him exactly where to look. He had his hand on the wall panel. Sully said he didn't think. He just put his head down and ran at the man like he was 66, going on 22, and he hit him so hard they both went through the panel and into the wall. And the brown envelope, 11 years sealed up in the dark, came loose and fell to the floor between them. They both scrambled for it. The man got a hand on the corner. Sully got both hands on the man's wrist and bit down, and I will spare you the details, but Sully came away with the envelope and a split eyebrow and 2 cracked ribs. And he went out the side door and across the field with that envelope inside his shirt, while a flashlight beam chased him through the dark and a voice behind him promised things I won't repeat. He got to his truck. And he drove to the only place he could think of where money couldn't follow him at midnight. He drove to the courthouse, parked in the lot, locked the doors, and sat there bleeding until morning, holding that envelope against his chest like it was a newborn. The hearing was 3 days later. They held it in the big courtroom on the 2nd floor, the one with the tall windows, in front of Judge Hargrove, a stern old woman who'd been on the bench longer than some of the lawyers in front of her had been alive. The room was packed. Half of Cutter's Bend showed up, and they did not show up for Shelby. They sat behind me, my neighbors, my customers. The man who runs the feed store, my granddaughter's old kindergarten teacher, all of them on my side of the aisle. And that gave me more strength than I can tell you. Quill ran his show first, and I'll admit he was good. He put up the doctored clinic record. He put up the bribed neighbor who swore to God he'd heard those children scream. He put my daughter-in-law on the stand, and she cried real tears and told the whole courtroom how she had spent 11 years searching for the babies a cruel old man had stolen from her, how she'd wept herself to sleep, how she'd hired detectives. My son sat behind her nodding along, and I watched the judge's face, and I watched it harden against me, and I knew right then that without that envelope, I was already a dead man. Paper or no paper, the public defender couldn't have saved me. The lie was too good. But before they could rest their case, my granddaughter stood up. She wasn't on the witness list. The young public defender had been too scared to call a minor, but she stood up in the gallery in the dress she wore for choir concerts, 16 years old and steady as a stone. And she said, "Your Honor, I'd like to speak. Those are my parents and I have something to say." Quill objected, of course. He objected loud, but Judge Hargrove looked at that girl for a long moment, and then she said, "I think this court would very much like to hear from the child everyone's been speaking for. Come up here, young lady." I will remember what my granddaughter said until the day they put me in the ground. She got up on that stand, and she did not cry, and she did not rage. She just told the truth, in order, the way I raised her to. She told the court she had been 5 years old when her parents left her and her baby brother on my porch. She told them she remembered it. The gravel, the headlights, her mother, not even getting out of the truck to say goodbye. She told them that her grandfather had fed her every morning of her life, that he'd sat up with her brother through the chicken pox and the broken arm, that he'd sold his motorcycle, though she didn't know yet why, and gone without. So she and her brother never went without. And then she looked across the courtroom at the woman who'd been crying for the cameras, and she said, "I don't have a single memory of you that isn't from a photograph. You are not the person who raised me. He is." And she pointed at me, and the courtroom was so quiet you could hear the old clock on the wall. That's when the doors at the back of the courtroom banged open like a shotgun going off, and Sully Pratt walked in. He looked terrible. Stitches over one eye, ribs taped under his shirt, 3 days unshaved, and he walked up that center aisle past the deputies and right up to my table. And he laid the brown envelope down in front of me, and he said loud enough for the whole room to hear, "Sorry I'm late, Earl. Traffic." I stood up. My knees cracked like they always do. I opened that envelope with hands that hadn't shaken once, and I drew out the notarized document, and I walked it up to the bench myself before anyone could stop me, and I laid it down in front of Judge Hargrove. She read it. I watched her eyes go down the page and then go back to the top and read it again. Then I laid the photograph beside it. The two of them, grinning, on the boat, in the sun, under the blue letters that spelled out second wind. Quill was on his feet shouting about forgery, demanding a forensic analysis, saying I'd had 11 years to fake it. But Judge Hargrove cut him off without even looking at him. She held that document up and she said, "Counselor, this is a notarized voluntary relinquishment of parental rights, executed by your clients, signed and witnessed and stamped, dated 11 years ago. The signatures match every document your clients have filed in my court this month, and this photograph appears to have been mailed by your own clients." She lowered it. She looked at Shelby, and then at my son, and her voice dropped to something cold and quiet. "You sold these children. And then you came into my courtroom and wept about losing them, to get at a dead man's money. Did these children know about this?" And that's when she looked at me. And I told her the truth. "Not yet," I said, "but they're about to." It came apart fast for them after that. The relinquishment was airtight. The malnutrition record fell to pieces the moment Dr. Holloway's 11 years of files got entered alongside it. The neighbor who'd sworn he heard screaming folded under 5 minutes of questions and admitted he'd been paid. And that opened a whole other door that Lawrence Quill walked through in handcuffs of his own a few months later, on charges of bribery and falsifying evidence. The custody petition was dismissed with prejudice, which the public defender told me means they can never bring it again. Not ever. The trust went into a protective arrangement with the children as sole beneficiaries and a court-appointed administrator, and the guardian named to look after them. The one Crandall's lawyers and the judge agreed on, without a moment's hesitation, was me. My son and my daughter-in-law walked out of that courthouse with nothing. No money, no children, no boat that had been repossessed years back, and a fraud investigation following them out the door. I haven't heard from them since, and I've made my peace with the fact that I probably never will. I won't pretend there isn't a piece of me that grieves for the boy my son used to be, the one who rode on the gas tank of that shovelhead when he was 6. But that boy's been gone a long time. You can grieve a person who's still walking around. I do, some nights. I did 3 things after the dust settled. The first was, I went and bought my grandson his cleats, the good ones, and a whole lot more besides, because the trust covers the children well, and I make sure every dollar of it goes to them, and not 1 penny to me beyond what the court sets. The second was that I sat both kids down at the kitchen table, the same table where their father once offered to sell them, and I told them everything, all of it. The night on the porch, the boat, the envelope. I'd been afraid my whole life that knowing would break them. It didn't. My granddaughter took my hand and said, "Pop, you didn't buy us. You saved us. There's a difference." And the difference is you lured that girl. And the third thing I did was for Sully. The court, as part of the mess, eventually located and sold off the last asset connected to the relinquishment fraud. And there was a small settlement attached to it, and I made sure a good chunk of it went to my friend who walked through 3 hired men and a wall to bring me that envelope. He fussed and said he didn't want it. I told him a man who bleeds for you in your own shop at midnight doesn't get a vote. He's got new shocks under the salvage truck now, and a fishing rig of his own. A little aluminum boat. Nothing fancy. We take it out on the reservoir on Sundays, him and me and the 2 kids, and we don't catch much, and we don't care. People love to say blood is thicker than water. They say it like it settles something. They use it to tell you that you have to forgive anything, take anything from people who happen to share your last name. I believed that once. It took a man I raised offering to sell his own children for the price of a boat to teach me different. Blood is just what's in your veins. It doesn't make anybody stay. The man who stayed up with my grandson through a fever, the friend who took 3 cracked ribs for me without being asked, the girl who stood up in a courtroom and chose me out loud in front of the whole town, that's not blood. That's something a man earns and a man gives. That's family. And I'm 68 years old with bad knees and an empty spot in the garage where a motorcycle used to be, and I have never in my life been richer than I am right now on this reservoir on a Sunday with the only 2 people in the world who ever really belonged to me. I keep thinking about the moment my son sat at my kitchen table and offered to sell me his own children for $25,000, and how that single choice set everything else in motion. Nothing that happened to him afterward was bad luck. A man who treats his kids like baggage will eventually be a man with nothing in his arms, and that's not a curse anybody put on him. That's just what comes back around when you plant that kind of seed. He chose the boat. He chose Florida. 11 years later, he chose to walk into a courtroom and lie, and every one of those choices was a brick in the wall he ended up standing behind, alone. What saved me wasn't anger, and Lord knows I had plenty of it. It was 3 things I'd been building my whole life without ever naming them. The first was simply refusing to do the wrong thing, even when the wrong thing was easier. I could have spent that envelope money on myself. I could have let my son take the kids and wash my hands of it. Doing right by those children when nobody was watching is the only reason I had a leg to stand on when everybody finally was. The second thing was thinking 2 moves ahead. When my son said he'd sign whatever I wanted, a tired man would have just taken the kids and felt grateful. Instead, I drove to the bank, got cash, found a notary, and made him sign in front of witnesses. I didn't know I'd need that paper. I knew that not having it would be the kind of mistake you can't undo. 11 years of foresight fit inside one brown envelope, and the third thing was the plain refusal to quit. Raising 2 kids on a body shop pension past 60, sitting handcuffed in a cell while a rich woman cried on television, watching the judge's face turn against me. None of that is the kind of thing a man does because he feels like it. You do it because stopping isn't an option you'll allow yourself. Sully crawled through a wall with cracked ribs for the same reason. Marin stood up in that courtroom and pointed at me for the same reason. You keep going because the people you love are on the other side of going. If you take anything from an old man's story, take that. Be the kind of person who does right when it costs you. Be smart enough to protect the people you love before the storm, not after. And when the storm comes anyway, and it will, plant your feet and don't move. My son had more money, a better lawyer, and a head start, and he's still lost because character and patience and grit will outlast a $4 million trust every single time. I'm 68, my motorcycle's gone, and I won. That's no accident. That's just the harvest.